Picture this. I'm sitting on the balcony of a luxury resort in Maui, wearing my new wedding ring, and watching my husband David spread sunscreen on his shoulders when my phone rings with the call that would change everything. The number belonged to my company's HR department, and I almost didn't answer. After all, I was on my approved honeymoon vacation, something I'd planned and requested months in advance. But something in my gut told me to pick up. Patricia Walsh's voice came through the speaker with all the warmth of a funeral director. "Marilyn, we're terminating your employment effective immediately for insubordination and abandonment of duties." My new husband's jaw dropped as he heard every word. Within minutes, my corporate credit cards were declined at the resort restaurant, leaving us scrambling to figure out how we'd even pay for our remaining hotel nights. What they didn't know was that their rushed decision to fire me would soon become the most expensive mistake in company history. Let me take you back 3 months to where this nightmare actually began. I had just finished my best quarter ever as Senior Marketing Director at Techno Global Solutions, a mid-sized consulting firm in downtown Phoenix. My team had landed the Morrison Industries account worth $1.2 million annually, and I'd been personally commended by our CEO, Marcus Thompson, during the quarterly all-hands meeting. I still remember the way he shook my hand that day, telling the entire company how my innovative digital strategy had put us ahead of competitors who'd been chasing Morrison for years. The timing couldn't have been better for my wedding request. David and I had been engaged for 18 months, and with my recent promotion to senior director, I finally felt secure enough to plan the honeymoon we'd been dreaming about. I submitted my vacation request through the proper channels, detailing my plans for a 2-week absence that would include our wedding weekend and 10 days in Hawaii. I'd never taken more than 4 consecutive days off in my 5 years with the company. My direct supervisor, Janet Phillips, approved the request with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm. She even helped me plan the client transition, working with me to create detailed handover documents for every active project. We scheduled strategy meetings with junior staff members, prepared emergency contact protocols, and established clear boundaries about when I should and shouldn't be reached during my time away. Janet insisted that the company's vacation policy was sacred, reminding me that our employee handbook explicitly protected approved time off from work interference. The handover process took 3 full weeks. I created comprehensive project briefs for the Morrison account, outlining every detail from their preferred communication style to their quarterly budget review schedule. My assistant Kelly received training on managing my calendar and handling routine client communications. I even recorded video explanations for our more complex marketing automation systems, just in case technical issues arose while I was away. Everything seemed perfectly orchestrated until my final week before the wedding. That's when I started noticing Janet's behavior shifting in subtle but unsettling ways. She began asking probing questions about my commitment to the company, wondering aloud whether I'd be mentally present when I returned from such an extended break. During our last team meeting, she made an offhand comment about hoping I wouldn't get too comfortable with the vacation lifestyle and forget about my responsibilities. But the real shock came on my last day in the office when I was cleaning out my desk to make room for temporary coverage. I accidentally opened a file folder that had been left on Janet's chair, and what I saw inside made my blood run cold. It contained documentation I'd never seen before, incident reports claiming I'd shown resistance to flexible scheduling, attitude problems during client interactions, and unwillingness to prioritize company needs over personal preferences. The reports were dated over the past 6 months, describing conversations and incidents that had never actually happened. I photographed every page with my phone, my hands shaking as I realized that Janet had been building a case against me for months. These fabricated incidents painted a picture of an employee who was difficult, inflexible, and potentially insubordinate. The most recent entry, dated just 2 days earlier, claimed I had expressed reluctance about maintaining client relationships during approved vacation time, during a conversation that had never taken place. That afternoon, I confronted Janet, directly asking her to explain the documentation I'd discovered. Her response was chilling in its casualness. She claimed the reports were routine performance tracking and suggested that I might be overreacting due to wedding stress. When I pressed her about specific incidents that I knew hadn't happened, she simply shrugged and said that perception often matters more than reality in corporate environments. I left the office that evening with a growing sense of unease, but I pushed my concerns aside. After all, I was getting married in 3 days, and I had vacation time that had been officially approved by both Janet and upper management. Whatever game Janet was playing, I figured it would have to wait until I returned from Hawaii. The wedding itself was everything David and I had dreamed it would be. We held the ceremony at a small chapel in Scottsdale, surrounded by 50 of our closest friends and family members. David looked incredible in his charcoal gray suit, and I felt like a princess in my grandmother's vintage lace dress, which had been altered to fit perfectly. Our reception featured a live jazz trio and dancing under string lights that twinkled like stars against the Arizona desert sky. Our families embraced each other with genuine warmth, and even my usually critical mother admitted that David was perfect for me. His parents, who'd flown in from Minnesota, spent hours sharing embarrassing childhood stories about their son making me fall in love with him all over again. We cut our 3-tier vanilla cake while everyone cheered, and David surprised me by having the band play our first dance song twice because he wasn't ready for the moment to end. The flight to Hawaii the next morning felt like stepping into a fairy tale. We'd splurged on first-class tickets, something neither of us had ever experienced before, and the flight attendants treated us like celebrities when they learned we were newlyweds. The airplane offered unlimited champagne, gourmet meals, and seats that reclined into actual beds. David held my hand during takeoff, both of us grinning like teenagers as Phoenix disappeared below the clouds. Our resort in Maui exceeded every expectation. The Ocean Vista Resort sat directly on Kaanapali Beach, with our oceanfront suite offering unobstructed views of the Pacific. Our balcony featured a private hot tub, comfortable lounge chairs, and a dining table where we planned to enjoy room service breakfasts while watching the sunrise. The bathroom was larger than some apartments, complete with a rainfall shower and a soaking tub big enough for 2 people. The first 3 days passed in pure bliss. We snorkeled at Molokini Crater, where David surprised me by staying underwater long enough to spell out "I love you" with his hands while tropical fish swam around us. We took a helicopter tour of the island, gasping at waterfalls that plunged hundreds of feet into emerald pools. We attended a traditional luau, where David gamely attempted to learn the hula dance, while I laughed until my sides ached. On our 4th morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls from Janet's number. My stomach dropped as I realized something was wrong, but I couldn't imagine what emergency could be so urgent that it couldn't wait until I returned to work. I called her back while David was in the shower, expecting to hear about some minor client concern that could be easily resolved. Instead, Janet's voice was sharp with barely controlled anger. She informed me that Morrison Industries had encountered a crisis situation that required immediate attention from their primary account manager. The crisis, she explained, involved a social media backlash against one of Morrison's recent advertising campaigns, and they needed emergency damage control within 24 hours. I reminded Janet that we had discussed potential emergencies during my handover process and that Kelly had been trained specifically to handle Morrison communications in my absence. Janet cut me off, insisting that Morrison had specifically requested my personal involvement and that my refusal to help would constitute a breach of our service agreement. The conversation grew increasingly heated as Janet demanded that I join a video conference that afternoon to discuss crisis management strategies. When I politely declined, explaining that I was on my approved honeymoon and that our emergency protocols should be sufficient, Janet's tone became openly hostile. She accused me of abandoning my responsibilities and putting personal pleasure above professional obligations. Over the next 2 days, the calls became relentless. Janet phoned every few hours, each time insisting that the Morrison situation was escalating and that my continued absence was damaging the company's reputation. She sent urgent text messages claiming that Morrison executives were threatening to terminate their contract unless I personally handled their crisis. David watched my stress levels climb with each interaction, finally suggesting that I turn off my phone entirely. But I couldn't bring myself to do it, worried that ignoring the calls might actually create the problems Janet was describing. Instead, I continued to politely decline each request, reminding Janet that my vacation had been approved through proper channels and that emergency protocols existed for situations exactly like this. On the 6th day of our honeymoon, Janet's calls took an even more disturbing turn. She began leaving voicemails claiming that she'd been telling Morrison executives that I was available but choosing not to help them. According to Janet, she'd assured the client that I would handle their crisis personally, and my refusal to cooperate was making her look incompetent and dishonest. When I called her back to address this misrepresentation, Janet admitted that she'd been promising Morrison my personal involvement without consulting me first. She'd told them that I would cut my vacation short if necessary, and that my dedication to their account was unwavering. Now that I was refusing to live up to these unauthorized promises, Janet claimed that Morrison was threatening legal action against TechnoGlobal for breach of contract. The manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity. Janet had created a crisis by making promises she had no authority to make, and now she was demanding that I sacrifice my honeymoon to clean up her mess. When I pointed out the obvious problems with her approach, she simply replied that client expectations matter more than employee convenience. That night, as David and I sat on our balcony watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of gold and crimson, I finally understood that this wasn't really about Morrison Industries or social media crises. Janet was testing my boundaries, pushing to see how far she could manipulate me into abandoning my rights as an employee. The fake documentation I discovered in her office suddenly made perfect sense. She was building a case to justify whatever punishment she had planned for my refusal to comply. The morning of our 7th day in paradise started like any other. David had ordered room service breakfast, and we were planning to spend the day exploring the road to Hana, a scenic drive that promised waterfalls, bamboo forests, and some of the most spectacular views in Hawaii. I was applying sunscreen when my phone rang with a call from TechnoGlobal's main office number. The caller ID showed Patricia Walsh, the company's HR director, someone I'd interacted with only during annual performance reviews and benefits enrollment periods. Patricia had always seemed professional, but distant, the kind of person who spoke in corporate buzzwords and rarely showed genuine emotion. I assumed she was calling to discuss Janet's increasingly erratic behavior, perhaps to apologize for the harassment I'd been experiencing during my vacation. I was completely unprepared for what came next. Patricia's voice was crisp and businesslike as she informed me that TechnoGlobal was terminating my employment, effective immediately. The charges against me included insubordination, abandonment of duties, and failure to maintain professional client relationships. She explained that my refusal to assist with the Morrison Industries crisis had been interpreted as a willful violation of my employment obligations. David stopped spreading cream cheese on his bagel and stared at me in disbelief as Patricia continued her scripted termination speech. She informed me that my company email access had been revoked, my office keycard had been deactivated, and my corporate credit cards had been canceled. I would not be receiving severance pay, and my accrued vacation time would be forfeited due to the nature of my termination. The surreal quality of the moment was overwhelming. I was sitting in paradise wearing a bikini and flip-flops, being fired over the phone by someone who'd never even supervised my work. Patricia spoke as if she were reading from a prepared statement, showing no acknowledgement of my 5 years of exemplary service or the circumstances surrounding my absence. When I asked for specific details about the accusations against me, Patricia referred vaguely to documented performance issues and recent incidents of unprofessional behavior. She mentioned that my immediate supervisor had provided extensive documentation supporting the termination decision, but she couldn't provide specifics over the phone. The most shocking revelation came when I asked whether the company had followed standard termination procedures outlined in our employee handbook. Patricia paused for several seconds before admitting that the decision had been made verbally by the executive team and that formal documentation would be prepared later. She couldn't explain why I hadn't received any written warnings or been given an opportunity to respond to the allegations against me. David grabbed a hotel notepad and began frantically taking notes as Patricia spoke, his paralegal training kicking in automatically. He scribbled down key phrases like, "no written documentation," "verbal decision only," and "no due process followed." His expression grew more incredulous with each detail Patricia revealed. As the call continued, Patricia's script began to fall apart. She admitted that she hadn't personally reviewed my performance history before approving the termination, and that her knowledge of the situation came entirely from Janet's reports. When I asked whether she'd spoken to any of my clients or team members about my work quality, she acknowledged that no such conversations had taken place. The final straw came when Patricia mentioned that the company expected me to return any confidential materials or equipment I might have taken on vacation. When I pointed out that I'd specifically avoided bringing any work materials on my honeymoon, she seemed surprised and had to put me on hold to check with management about what I might have in my possession. By the time the call ended, David was filling his third page of notes, his expression shifting from disbelief to anger to something approaching excitement. As someone who worked in the legal field, he recognized immediately that TechnoGlobal had made serious procedural errors in their rush to terminate me. The immediate practical consequences hit us within hours. When we tried to pay for lunch at the resort restaurant, my corporate credit card was declined with a loud beep that drew stares from other diners. The hotel's business center wouldn't accept my company card for internet access, and even the spa canceled my afternoon massage appointment when their payment processing failed. David called his bank to increase our personal credit limit so we could cover the remaining hotel expenses, but the financial embarrassment was devastating. We'd planned this honeymoon carefully, budgeting for activities and meals, while relying on my corporate card for emergencies. Now we were stranded 3,000 miles from home, with limited cash and no clear understanding of what had just happened to my career. That evening, as we sat on our balcony trying to process the day's events, I found myself questioning everything I'd believed about corporate loyalty and employee rights. I'd given TechnoGlobal 5 years of dedicated service, sacrificing evenings and weekends to exceed performance goals and build client relationships. I'd delayed my wedding twice to accommodate major project deadlines, and I'd never taken more than 4 consecutive vacation days in half a decade. But what hurt most wasn't the financial inconvenience or even the professional humiliation. It was the realization that Janet had been planning this outcome from the moment I submitted my vacation request. The fake documentation, the impossible demands, the unauthorized promises to Morrison Industries, they were all part of a calculated strategy to create grounds for termination. David reached over and took my hand as tears started rolling down my cheeks. For the first time since our wedding, I wondered whether we'd made a mistake by planning such an expensive honeymoon. The irony was bitter. I was being punished for taking the vacation time I'd earned while sitting in a place I might not have been able to afford without the job I'd just lost. That night, neither David nor I could sleep. We sat in our hotel room, with his laptop researching employment law, while room service delivered coffee and chocolate cake at 2 a.m. David's background as a paralegal at Morrison Tucker & Associates had given him extensive knowledge of workplace regulations, and he immediately recognized several red flags in how TechnoGlobal had handled my termination. The first issue was procedural. Arizona is an at-will employment state, which means companies can terminate employees for almost any reason, but they still must follow their own published policies when doing so. David pulled up TechnoGlobal's employee handbook, which I'd saved as a PDF on my personal computer years earlier, and we spent hours reviewing the termination procedures section. According to the company's own written policies, any termination for cause required a documented progressive discipline process. Employees accused of performance issues must receive written warnings, opportunities to improve, and formal performance improvement plans before termination could be considered. The handbook specifically stated that no employee will be terminated for cause without receiving prior written notice of deficiencies and a reasonable opportunity to address identified concerns. More importantly, the handbook contained explicit protections for approved vacation time. Section 4.7 stated that employees using approved vacation time shall not be required to perform work duties except in cases of genuine emergency affecting client safety or legal compliance. The section went on to define genuine emergencies as situations involving potential physical harm, regulatory violations, or imminent legal deadlines that couldn't be addressed through established backup procedures. David highlighted key passages as we read building a case file, even though we hadn't yet decided to pursue legal action. His attention to detail was remarkable. He cross-referenced policy numbers, noted discrepancies between written procedures and actual practices, and created a timeline of events that demonstrated clear procedural violations. The more we researched, the more obvious it became that Techno Global had rushed through my termination without following basic legal protections. They'd fired me for refusing to work during approved vacation time, something their own policies explicitly prohibited. They'd terminated me without written warnings, performance improvement plans, or any documentation of deficiencies in my work. By sunrise, David had compiled a 20-page document outlining potential legal violations, including wrongful termination, breach of contract, and violation of Arizona wage and hour laws. He'd also researched recent court cases involving similar situations, finding several examples where employees had successfully sued companies for terminating them during protected vacation time. But the breakthrough came when David suggested we contact his former colleague, Sarah Martinez, who'd left Morrison Tucker and Associates to start her own employment law practice. Sarah specialized in wrongful termination cases, and David thought she might be willing to provide a consultation even while we were still in Hawaii. Sarah answered her phone on the second ring, despite the early hour in Phoenix. When David explained our situation, her interest was immediately piqued. She asked detailed questions about the termination process, the fake documentation I'd discovered, and the circumstances surrounding Janet's demands that I work during my honeymoon. What Sarah told us next changed everything. She explained that Techno Global was already under federal investigation by the Department of Labor for potential violations of the Family and Medical Leave Act. 2 other female employees had filed complaints in the past year, alleging that the company had retaliated against them for using protected leave time. The federal investigators were specifically looking for patterns of discrimination against women who asserted their workplace rights. Sarah's excitement was palpable as she realized that my case fit perfectly into the pattern federal investigators were documenting. A female employee being terminated for using approved vacation time, fake documentation being created to justify the termination, and a female supervisor pressuring me to violate company policy to cover for her own mistakes. It all suggested systemic problems with how Techno Global treated women employees. Even better, Sarah had recently won a similar case against another Phoenix company, securing a 6-figure settlement for a client who'd been fired for refusing to work during protected medical leave. She understood exactly how to approach Techno Global's legal vulnerabilities, and she was confident that my documentation would support a strong wrongful termination claim. Sarah offered to take my case on a contingency fee basis, meaning she wouldn't charge legal fees unless we won a settlement or court judgment. She explained that my case was particularly strong because Techno Global had violated both state employment laws and federal regulations, giving us multiple avenues for legal action. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours, with Sarah taking detailed notes about every aspect of my employment history and termination. She was particularly interested in the fake incident reports Janet had created, recognizing them as potential evidence of premeditated retaliation. She also noted that Patricia Walsh's admission about the lack of written documentation could be used to demonstrate that the termination was arbitrary and procedurally improper. Before hanging up, Sarah outlined our next steps. She would immediately send Techno Global a formal demand letter outlining the legal violations and requesting my immediate reinstatement with full back pay. She would also notify the Department of Labor investigators about my case, providing them with additional evidence for their ongoing investigation. David and I spent the rest of the morning walking along Kaanapali Beach, discussing our options and trying to process everything Sarah had told us. The idea of fighting back against Techno Global was both exciting and terrifying, but we both felt that staying silent would only enable them to continue mistreating other employees. As we watched surfers catch waves in the crystal clear water, I realized that my termination might actually be a blessing in disguise. For years, I'd suspected that Janet was creating a hostile work environment, but I'd never had clear evidence of her behavior. Now her manipulation and fake documentation were fully exposed, and we had the legal expertise to hold both her and the company accountable. The decision to fight back wasn't just about my own career. It was about protecting future employees from Janet's retaliation and forcing Techno Global to follow their own written policies. If we could expose the systemic problems in their human resources practices, we might prevent other women from experiencing the same discriminatory treatment. Sarah Martinez moved with the efficiency of a legal surgeon. By noon Hawaii time, she'd drafted and sent a comprehensive demand letter to Techno Global's executive team, human resources department, and board of directors. The letter detailed every procedural violation, cited specific sections of both state and federal law that had been broken, and demanded my immediate reinstatement with full back pay and benefits. What made Sarah's approach particularly devastating was her decision to copy the letter to external parties who could create immediate pressure on the company. She sent copies to the Department of Labor investigators already examining TechnoGlobal, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and the Arizona Attorney General's office. She also forwarded the letter to TechnoGlobal's corporate insurance carrier, knowing that employment practices liability claims could trigger expensive legal reviews. The letter outlined 12 specific legal violations ranging from wrongful termination and breach of contract to potential violations of federal anti-retaliation statutes. Sarah had included excerpts from TechnoGlobal's own employee handbook showing how the company had failed to follow its published procedures. She'd also attached copies of the fake incident reports I'd photographed demonstrating a clear pattern of document fabrication and employee harassment. Most importantly, Sarah had framed my case as part of a larger pattern of gender discrimination that federal investigators were already documenting. She noted that TechnoGlobal appeared to have a systematic problem with retaliating against female employees who asserted their legal rights, and she suggested that my termination was the most egregious example yet discovered. The corporate response was swift and panicked. Within 4 hours of Sarah's letter being delivered, my phone rang with a call from Patricia Walsh. Her voice was completely different from the cold professional tone she'd used during my termination call. Now she sounded nervous, almost pleading, as she explained that there had been a misunderstanding about the circumstances of my employment termination. Patricia claimed that she'd received additional information, suggesting that my termination had been hasty and potentially inappropriate. She offered to immediately reinstate me with full back pay, restore my benefits, and provide a formal letter of apology. She insisted that the company valued my contributions and wanted to work together to resolve the situation amicably. David grabbed his notepad as Patricia spoke, documenting every offer and admission she made during the conversation. Her desperation was obvious as she repeatedly emphasized that TechnoGlobal was a family-friendly company that would never intentionally violate employee rights. She claimed that my termination had been based on incomplete information and that the company was committed to making things right. When I asked Patricia to explain what new information had prompted this sudden change of heart, she hesitated before mentioning that the company's legal counsel had reviewed my file and identified potential procedural concerns. She couldn't provide specifics over the phone, but she assured me that TechnoGlobal was taking immediate steps to address any policy violations that might have occurred. The most revealing moment came when Patricia accidentally disclosed information she clearly wasn't supposed to share. While explaining why the company was eager to resolve the situation quickly, she mentioned that Janet Phillips had been providing questionable documentation to support employee discipline decisions. According to Patricia, the legal team had discovered inconsistencies in Janet's reports about multiple female employees, not just me. Patricia immediately tried to backtrack, claiming that she'd misspoken and that Janet remained a valued member of the management team. But David had already written down every word, and we both recognized the significance of her admission. TechnoGlobal's own investigation was revealing that Janet had been falsifying employee records, potentially exposing the company to massive legal liability. The conversation took an even more interesting turn when Patricia began asking questions about whether I'd shared information about my termination with anyone outside the company. She seemed particularly concerned about whether I'd spoken to attorneys, government agencies, or former colleagues who might have connections to TechnoGlobal's clients or competitors. When I mentioned that I'd consulted with legal counsel, as was my right, Patricia's voice became openly worried. She asked whether my attorney was local and whether we were planning to pursue formal legal action against the company. I told her truthfully that those decisions hadn't been finalized, but that we were exploring all available options. Patricia ended the call by offering to arrange a conference call with CEO Marcus Thompson, where we could discuss my reinstatement terms in detail. She emphasized that the company was willing to be generous and flexible in addressing any concerns I might have about my employment experience. She also mentioned that TechnoGlobal would be willing to provide additional compensation beyond basic back pay to ensure that I felt fairly treated. After hanging up, David and I looked at each other in amazement. In less than 12 hours, TechnoGlobal had gone from firing me for insubordination to offering reinstatement and additional compensation. The speed of their reversal demonstrated just how seriously they were taking the legal implications of their actions. Sarah called us that evening with even more dramatic news. TechnoGlobal's corporate attorneys had contacted her directly, requesting an immediate meeting to discuss settlement terms. According to Sarah, the company's lawyers were extremely concerned about the federal investigation implications and wanted to resolve my case before it became part of the larger discrimination inquiry. Even more interesting, Sarah had received a call from another attorney representing a different former TechnoGlobal employee who'd been terminated under questionable circumstances. Apparently, news of my case was spreading through Phoenix's legal community, and other potential victims of the company's discriminatory practices were coming forward with their own stories. Sarah explained that TechnoGlobal was facing the possibility of a class action lawsuit involving multiple female employees who'd been terminated or disciplined for asserting their workplace rights. My case was particularly damaging because it involved such clear documentation of fake incident reports and procedural violations. The company's attorneys understood that losing my case could open the floodgates for similar claims from other employees. As David and I fell asleep that night, we realized that our decision to fight back was already having consequences far beyond our individual situation. TechnoGlobal was scrambling to contain a scandal that could destroy their reputation and cost them millions in legal settlements. And we were just getting started. 2 weeks after returning from Hawaii, David and I found ourselves sitting in a federal mediation conference room in downtown Phoenix, facing the most uncomfortable corporate executives I'd ever seen. The mediation had been arranged at TechnoGlobal's insistence, as their attorneys desperately tried to avoid the public scrutiny that would come with a formal lawsuit or federal investigation hearing. The company's legal team was led by Catherine Morrison from Preston & Associates, one of Phoenix's most expensive corporate defense firms. Catherine was accompanied by 2 junior attorneys who spent most of the session frantically taking notes and passing documents back and forth. On TechnoGlobal's side sat CEO Marcus Thompson, looking pale and agitated, along with Patricia Walsh, who couldn't seem to make eye contact with anyone in the room. Notably absent was Janet Phillips, whose employment status had become unclear, according to the vague statements from TechnoGlobal's attorneys. When Sarah asked directly about Janet's role in my termination, Catherine Morrison claimed that Janet was no longer available to participate in company proceedings due to unrelated personal circumstances. The mediation began with Catherine Morrison reading aloud from a prepared statement acknowledging that TechnoGlobal had failed to follow established procedures in handling my employment termination. The statement admitted that the company had violated its own employee handbook, failed to provide appropriate due process protections, and terminated me without proper documentation of performance deficiencies. What made this admission particularly devastating was watching Marcus Thompson's face as his own attorney detailed the company's legal violations. The man who'd once praised my performance in front of the entire company now sat slumped in his chair, occasionally shaking his head, in what appeared to be disbelief at the scope of the problems his management team had created. But the real bombshell came when Sarah presented evidence that TechnoGlobal's attorneys hadn't yet seen. During her investigation, she'd obtained email records through the discovery process that revealed the full extent of Janet Phillips' document falsification scheme. The emails showed that Janet had been creating fake incident reports, not just for me, but for at least 5 other female employees over the past 2 years. Even more shocking, the emails revealed that Janet had been manipulating client relationships to create justification for disciplining employees who didn't comply with her demands. In my case, she'd actually told Morrison Industries that I was problematic and difficult to work with, while simultaneously promising them my personal involvement in their projects. When I refused to work during my approved vacation, she used that refusal as evidence that her negative assessments had been accurate. Catherine Morrison's composure cracked as Sarah presented email after email showing Janet's systematic manipulation of employee records. In one particularly damaging exchange, Janet had instructed her assistant to backdate performance complaints to make them appear more serious than they actually were. In another, she'd coached Patricia Walsh on how to phrase termination justifications to avoid triggering employment law protections. Marcus Thompson's face went from pale to gray as the full scope of Janet's misconduct became clear. At one point, he actually interrupted his own attorney to ask how long this pattern of behavior had been going on without his knowledge. When Catherine Morrison couldn't provide a clear answer, Marcus demanded to know how many other employees might have been wrongfully terminated based on Janet's fake documentation. The mediation took an unexpected turn when Sarah revealed that she'd been contacted by Morrison Industries directly. Apparently, the client crisis that had supposedly justified my termination had been completely fabricated. Morrison's marketing director, Jennifer Walsh, had told Sarah that their company had never requested emergency assistance during my vacation period and that they'd been confused by Janet's increasingly frantic calls, claiming that I was refusing to help them. According to Jennifer Walsh, Morrison Industries had actually been pleased with the transition planning I'd arranged before my vacation. Kelly, my assistant, had handled their routine communications perfectly, and they'd never felt that my absence was creating any problems. Janet's claims about social media crises and threatened contract cancellations had been entirely fictional. This revelation destroyed what remained of TechnoGlobal's defense. They could no longer claim that my termination had been justified by client demands or business necessities. Instead, it became clear that I'd been fired for refusing to participate in a crisis that existed only in Janet Phillips' imagination. The final shock came when federal agents arrived at the mediation session unannounced. Special Agent Robert Chen from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division served Marcus Thompson with a warrant related to their investigation of potential mail and wire fraud charges against Janet Phillips. According to Agent Chen, Janet had been embezzling client retainer fees for over 18 months, using fake employee discipline cases to distract attention from missing money. The embezzlement scheme was both sophisticated and brazen. Janet had been collecting client payments into unauthorized accounts, then creating employee crises to explain delays in project delivery or budget overruns. When clients complained about service problems, she blamed difficult employees like me using our supposed misconduct to justify delays while she struggled to replace the stolen funds. My termination hadn't been about vacation time or client relations at all. It had been Janet's desperate attempt to cover her financial crimes by eliminating an employee who might have discovered her scheme. The Morrison Industries crisis, the urgent calls during my honeymoon, the fake documentation, it had all been designed to create a plausible narrative for firing me before I could uncover evidence of her embezzlement. As federal agents placed Janet Phillips under arrest in the building's lobby, Marcus Thompson sat in stunned silence, finally understanding that his company had become the victim of an elaborate fraud scheme. The legal implications were staggering: wrongful termination lawsuits, federal criminal charges, regulatory violations, and potential civil liability to defrauded clients. Catherine Morrison requested an immediate recess to consult with her clients about settlement terms. When the mediation resumed an hour later, TechnoGlobal's offer had increased dramatically. They were now proposing $200,000 in compensation, a public apology implementation of new human resources oversight procedures, and a commitment to cooperate fully with ongoing federal investigations. Sarah looked at me across the conference table, raising an eyebrow in silent question about whether I was ready to accept their offer. After 5 hours of devastating revelations about corporate misconduct and criminal fraud, TechnoGlobal was finally ready to acknowledge the full scope of the injustice I'd experienced. 6 months later, I stood in the lobby of my own marketing consultancy, watching my assistant hang a framed article from the Phoenix Business Journal with the headline, "Former TechnoGlobal Director Launches Successful Independent Practice." The article featured a photo of me shaking hands with Jennifer Walsh from Morrison Industries, the first major client to follow me from my old company to my new venture. The settlement with TechnoGlobal had been finalized within 30 days of the mediation conference. $200,000 in compensation, a formal public apology printed in the Arizona Republic, and a commitment to implement comprehensive human resources reforms under federal oversight. Marcus Thompson had personally signed the settlement agreement, along with a letter acknowledging that my termination had been unjustified and procedurally improper. But the money was only part of the justice we achieved. Janet Phillips had been sentenced to 3 years in federal prison for mail fraud, wire fraud, and embezzlement of client funds totaling over $400,000. The federal investigation had uncovered a pattern of financial crimes spanning nearly 2 years, during which Janet had systematically stolen from clients while creating fake employee discipline cases to distract from her misconduct. Patricia Walsh had been terminated immediately after the mediation with TechnoGlobal, acknowledging that her failure to follow proper termination procedures had exposed the company to massive legal liability. The company implemented mandatory training for all managers on employment law compliance, and they hired an external firm to audit their human resources practices quarterly to prevent future violations. Marcus Thompson had resigned as CEO within 90 days of our settlement, citing his failure to detect and prevent the systemic problems in his company's management structure. The board of directors appointed an interim CEO who immediately instituted policies protecting employees from retaliation and requiring multiple approvals for any termination decisions. Most importantly, our case had opened the door for other TechnoGlobal employees to seek justice. Sarah Martinez ended up representing 7 additional women who'd been wrongfully disciplined or terminated based on Janet's false documentation. The total settlement amount for all cases exceeded $1.2 million, and TechnoGlobal was required to undergo 3 years of federal monitoring to ensure compliance with employment discrimination laws. But the personal satisfaction of building my own business had exceeded even the validation of legal victory. Morrison Industries had not only followed me to my new consultancy, they'd recommended me to 3 other major clients who were impressed by the way I'd handled the crisis at TechnoGlobal. My refusal to compromise my principles during my honeymoon had actually enhanced my professional reputation rather than damaging it. Jennifer Walsh from Morrison Industries told me later that watching me stand up to corporate bullying had convinced their executive team that I was exactly the kind of consultant they wanted representing their brand. They'd been horrified to learn that Janet Phillips had been lying about my availability and dedication, and they'd immediately terminated their relationship with TechnoGlobal when the full scope of the fraud became public. David had been my partner throughout the entire journey, from taking notes during that terrible termination call in Hawaii to helping me choose office furniture for our new consulting suite. His legal background had been invaluable during the litigation process, but his emotional support had been even more important. He'd never once suggested that I should simply accept TechnoGlobal's initial settlement offers or avoid the stress of fighting back. Sarah Martinez had become not just our attorney, but a close friend, someone we invited to dinner parties and holiday celebrations. She'd gone on to specialize in employment discrimination cases, using our success against TechnoGlobal as a foundation for helping dozens of other workers stand up to corporate retaliation and wrongful termination. The most rewarding aspect of the entire experience had been discovering that my willingness to fight back had inspired other employees to assert their rights as well. I'd received letters from women across Arizona sharing their own stories of workplace discrimination and thanking me for proving that corporate bullies could be held accountable for their actions. Kelly, my former assistant at TechnoGlobal, had joined my consultancy as operations manager after completing her business degree. She'd been horrified to learn about Janet's manipulation and document falsification, and she'd provided crucial testimony during the federal investigation. Working together in our new environment, free from corporate politics and retaliation, had been incredibly fulfilling for both of us. The lesson I'd learned from this entire ordeal was both simple and profound. Sometimes the most frightening thing you can do is also the most necessary thing you can do. Standing up to TechnoGlobal had felt terrifying at first, but backing down would have enabled Janet Phillips to continue her fraud and abuse for years longer. By refusing to be intimidated and documenting everything carefully, we'd not only protected my own rights, but potentially saved other employees from similar mistreatment. My honeymoon termination call had seemed like the worst thing that could happen to my career, but it had actually been the catalyst for the best thing that could happen to my professional life. Building my own consultancy had given me control over my schedule, my clients, and my values in ways that working for someone else never could have provided. The irony wasn't lost on me that TechnoGlobal's attempt to punish me for taking vacation time had ultimately funded my ability to take as much vacation time as I wanted for the rest of my career. David and I had already planned 3 more trips with the settlement money, including a delayed anniversary celebration in Italy and a photography expedition to Alaska. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was knowing that TechnoGlobal's federal monitoring requirements would protect future employees from the kind of abuse I'd experienced. The company was now required to maintain detailed documentation for all disciplinary actions, provide written warnings before any terminations, and submit quarterly reports to federal oversight agencies. No other employee would be fired based on fake incident reports or manipulated client relationships. As I locked up my office that evening and headed home to David, I reflected on how dramatically our lives had changed since that shocking phone call in Maui. What had started as the worst day of my professional life had become the foundation for a career that exceeded every dream I'd ever had about independence, success, and personal fulfillment. The experience had taught me that justice isn't something that just happens to you, it's something you have to fight for. But when you're willing to stand up for what's right, document everything carefully, and find the right allies to support your cause, even the most powerful corporations can be held accountable for their actions. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between standing up for yourself and avoiding conflict with powerful people? How did you handle it, and what advice would you give to someone facing a similar decision? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming workplace challenges and finding justice in unexpected places. And don't forget to share this with anyone who might be dealing with similar workplace issues. Sometimes knowing that others have successfully fought back can give people the courage they need to protect their own rights. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it reminds you that your value as a person and an employee doesn't depend on how others choose to treat you. You have the power to stand up for yourself, seek justice when you've been wronged, and build the career and life you truly deserve.